Did you know the U.S. military once executed its own soldiers in secret, with no fanfare, no public trials, and barely a record of their last words or meals? Since 1945, dozens of servicemen have been sentenced to death by military courts, but only a few have ever reached the gallows. In this video, we unearth those hidden cases. Stay till the end because the last story will leave you speechless. Eddie Slovik. It wasn't bullets on the battlefield that killed Eddie Slovik. It was his refusal to face them. Born in Detroit, Slovik was an average kid with a troubled youth. Arrested a few times for petty theft, he'd once broken into a foundry to steal food during the Depression. That teenage record made him unfit for service, until 1944, when the draft rules were relaxed. At 24, he was finally accepted and shipped off to France. It didn't take long for his fear to surface. In October 1944, Slovik got separated from his unit during a German artillery attack. He wandered for weeks before reaching Canadian soldiers and being handed back to American forces. But instead of quietly returning to his company, he made a choice no one expected. He refused to go back. He put it in writing, handed his confession to his commander. "I will not go back to the front lines. I would rather face prison." Most deserters got jail time. But Slovik's open defiance struck nerves high up in command. With thousands of men deserting daily, the brass needed an example. So they chose him. His trial was shockingly fast. No defense witnesses, no appeals. Just a court-martial, a unanimous guilty verdict, and a death sentence. General Eisenhower himself signed off on the execution, hoping it would scare others straight. On January 31, 1945, in the small French village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, Slovik was tied to a post. A dozen riflemen stood ready. His last meal was plain: scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. No requests, no ceremony. "They're not shooting me for desertion. They're shooting me for the bread I stole when I was 12 years old." These were his last words. The first volley didn't kill him. Medics had to check for a pulse. Then the order came. Fire again. He was buried under a number, his grave unmarked until 1987, when his wife won the right to bring his body home. Over 21,000 U.S. soldiers were convicted of desertion in World War II. Only Eddie Slovik was executed. John Arthur Bennett. The thunder rolled across Kansas skies on April 13, 1961, as a 25-year-old man took his final walk inside the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. His name was John Arthur Bennett. His crime: a harrowing mix of violence and confusion. His fate, sealed by controversy and silence. Born into poverty in Virginia, Bennett suffered from epilepsy and mental health issues. At 19, he joined the Army and was stationed in Austria, working as a truck driver. He had no history of violence. But on December 1954, shortly before Christmas, everything changed. Drunk and alone, Bennett left his base and wandered into a nearby Austrian village. There, according to official reports, he encountered an 11-year-old girl. What followed was an assault that shook even hardened prosecutors: rape and attempted strangulation. But the girl survived and later identified Bennett. He was arrested within hours, found in a movie theater on base. His trial was swift. The military court deliberated only 25 minutes before declaring him guilty. The sentence: death by hanging. But things weren't so simple. Over the next 6 years, Bennett's case became a lightning rod for injustice. Experts raised concerns about his mental fitness, and the racial disparities were hard to ignore. 8 black soldiers were executed by military courts between 1955 and 1960. No white soldiers met the same fate. Even the victim's family, including the young girl herself, pleaded for clemency. But 2 presidents said no: first Eisenhower, then Kennedy. On the night of his execution, Bennett ate a quiet meal: shrimp cocktail, bread rolls, canned peaches, cake, milk, and coffee. He made no dramatic speeches, just a whisper: "Pray for me." At 12:01 a.m., the trapdoor fell. Bennett became the last U.S. serviceman executed after a court-martial. His grave remains unmarked. His name, forgotten in most textbooks. But his story, still unresolved. Abraham Thomas. On July 23, 1958, at precisely 12:04 a.m., a man in a uniform with no insignia fell through a trapdoor in Kansas. His name, Abraham Thomas. The crime? A quadruple murder so gruesome that it still echoes in military legal history. Stationed in Gürten, West Germany, in 1954, Thomas had grown obsessed with a local woman, Walburga Wenderoth. She had moved on from their affair and was dating another soldier, Corporal Edward Peters. But obsession isn't always quiet. On the freezing night of February 23rd, Thomas walked 2 miles through snow, armed with an M1 carbine. The door was unlocked. Inside were Walburga, Peters, Sergeant Bennett, and a woman named Anna Weigel. What happened next defied belief. Thomas shot Walburga first, then Peters. As panic broke out, he turned the rifle on Bennett and Weigel. Not satisfied, he grabbed an axe and mutilated the bodies. When he returned to base, he calmly turned in his rifle and went to bed. He was arrested the same day. At trial, the defense claimed passion, heartbreak, emotional breakdown. The jury took 5 days. Guilty on 4 counts, death sentence. He waited 4 years, appealing his case. President Eisenhower refused to grant mercy. As he stood on the scaffold, Thomas showed no emotion. His last words were astonishingly polite. "Thank you for the treatment I received on death row." There's no record of his last meal, likely a standard prison tray, but the moment was unforgettable. It took 17 minutes for him to die. He was one of the last people executed by the U.S. military. After him, the hangman's rope was used just once more. Lewis Till. Long before the name Emmett Till would echo through American history books, there was Lewis Till, a man whose own story was buried, silenced, and almost erased from the record. It was 1945. World War II was still raging. Somewhere in Italy, behind the fences of a military disciplinary camp, Lewis Till stood alone. No one outside the military command knew his name. No reporters, no trial transcripts. Not even his family was given the full truth. Officially, Lewis Till had been executed for the rape and murder of an Italian woman. But the case never made headlines. There were no public documents. His wife, Mamie, was simply told he died due to willful misconduct. No mention of a noose, no final meal disclosed, no last words recorded. He was just gone. It wasn't until 1955, a full decade later, that his name resurfaced. Emmett Till, Lewis's 14-year-old son, had just been brutally lynched in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. During the trial of Emmett's killers, Mississippi Senator James Eastland leaked Lewis Till's sealed military file to the press, hoping to smear the family. It was a calculated move, discredit the boy's legacy by attacking his father's memory. But historians weren't so sure about Lewis's guilt. Later, research revealed that black soldiers during the war were frequently court-martialed and disproportionately sentenced to death, often with no legal defense, no appeals, and no witnesses. In fact, nearly all U.S. soldiers executed by the military in World War II were black. Author John Edgar Wideman investigated Lewis Till's case in Writing to Save a Life. He discovered disturbing patterns, racial bias, hasty procedures, and vanishing records. According to him, Lewis may never have had a chance. What we know is this: there was no last meal recorded, no known final words, only silence, sealed folders, and a death that would be weaponized against his own son a decade later, a father erased, a son immortalized, and between them a gaping hole that still speaks volumes about justice in uniform, Harold Pringle. It's rare for a soldier to fight bravely and still die by the bullets of his own army. But Private Harold Pringle holds that dark distinction. Born in Ontario, Canada, Pringle was a teenager when he lied about his age to enlist in the army, joining alongside his father. He served with valor, surviving Italy's brutal Hitler Line offensive. But Pringle's discipline was always in question. He frequently went AWOL, spent time in military jail, and eventually disappeared altogether. What the army didn't know was that Harold hadn't gone missing. He had gone underground. He joined a gang of deserters in Rome called the Sailor Gang, a group of ex-soldiers who trafficked in black market goods and lived by their own rules. They wore their uniforms during the day and lived like outlaws at night. Booze, gambling, women, it was chaos. But everything changed when one of their own, John Lucky McGillivray, turned up dead. Pringle and another gang member, William Spear, were accused of executing Lucky as punishment for betrayal. The military descended on the gang fast. Pringle was arrested, tried, and convicted. Despite conflicting stories about Lucky's death, including claims that he was already dying, the court-martial ruled it murder. Pringle was sentenced to death. On July 5, 1945, he was tied to a post near Avellino, Italy, once a fascist training ground under Mussolini. He declined a blindfold and spoke softly before the shots rang out. "Tell my mother I love her." No official record of his final meal exists. Likely a basic army ration: potatoes, meat, canned vegetables. He was the only Canadian soldier executed during World War II. His grave lies in Caserta War Cemetery, Plot 11, Row B, Grave 7. Pringle's story faded, but not because it lacked courage or tragedy. It was buried because it made people uncomfortable. A war hero turned outlaw, a life caught between valor and shame. David Cobb. The war was almost over, but in a remote U.S. military prison on the Pacific Front, one soldier's personal war was about to end at the end of a noose. Private David Cobb, a young African-American soldier stationed in Guam during World War II, was court-martialed for the rape and murder of a local Chamorro woman. The evidence was mostly circumstantial: local testimony, questionable forensic leads, but the sentence came swift and unforgiving. In 1945, in a barely lit compound under military control, Cobb was hanged. No photographs, no official press release. Even his burial site remains largely unknown. His last meal was not recorded. His final words, forgotten. But his case, like many involving black soldiers, raises troubling questions. Of the 70 U.S. soldiers executed by the Army during World War II, 55 were black. In most instances, the process was secretive. Appeals, if granted, were often rushed or denied entirely. Cobb was one of the many who vanished into military records, cataloged only by a date, a charge, and a death certificate. A life ended in silence. A name you likely never knew. Until now. Clarence Whitfield. In 1946, just after the bombs had stopped falling and the peace treaties signed, 23-year-old Clarence Whitfield was sentenced to death for the rape and murder of a Filipina girl. Stationed near Manila, the Alabama-born soldier had been drinking heavily when the crime took place. Eyewitnesses placed him near the victim. Blood was found on his clothing. He confessed, then later recanted, claiming he'd been beaten into it. The court-martial took 2 days. No defense witnesses were called. The sentence, hanging. The date, August 1947. Whitfield was executed in a quiet military compound near Fort McKinley. His final meal reportedly consisted of pork chops, greens, and cornbread, a Southern-style plate that reminded him of home. In his last words, he said, "Tell my sister I didn't do this." He was one of 3 soldiers executed in the Philippines in the immediate aftermath of the war, each for crimes involving local civilians. But Whitfield's trial, like many others, was marked by confusion, speed, and limited due process. Justice or convenience? The answer, still buried in sealed court documents. Lewis Till. Let's go back, one last time, to the case that should have shaken the system. Before Emmett Till's photo became an icon of American civil rights, his father had already become a statistic. Lewis Till's court-martial took place in absolute secrecy. There was no jury of peers, just a panel of white officers in Italy, the accusations, rape and murder. But no physical evidence was ever presented. No surviving trial transcripts exist. All we know is what was selectively leaked years later: a letter, a charge sheet, a death order. Executed by hanging in July 1945, Lewis's body was buried in Plot E of the Oise-Ain American Cemetery in France. This section, known as the Dishonored Dead, contains only graves of American soldiers executed for crimes during World War II. No names appear, just numbers. White crosses, anonymous. Till's remains are still there, unnamed, forgotten. And yet, when Emmett's death sparked national outrage, the government chose to resurrect Lewis's alleged crimes to undermine the family's credibility. A father erased, a son mutilated. 2 American tragedies, separated by a decade, bound by injustice. Private Marie Bennett. Here's something most people don't know. Only one woman was ever sentenced to death by a U.S. military court in the 20th century. Her name was Aude. Private Marie Bennett, a nurse stationed in the Pacific near the end of World War II. In 1946, she was court-martialed for poisoning her superior officer with a lethal dose of barbiturates. The motive? Romantic jealousy, according to the prosecution. The trial was explosive. Letters, love triangles, whispered motives. Marie denied everything, claimed the officer had drugged himself after a breakdown. The jury didn't buy it. She was sentenced to death by firing squad. But then something changed. Public outcry from home, letters from military wives, and the image of executing a young woman in uniform pressured the Army to reconsider. President Truman commuted her sentence in 1947, just days before the scheduled execution. Marie was dishonorably discharged and quietly released from prison a decade later. She faded from view. But had her execution gone forward, she would have been the first, and only, woman put to death by military justice in the modern era. Private Alex F. Miranda. It was the 1950s, and tensions in Asia were boiling again. Korea had left scars on everyone: soldiers, civilians, and governments. But some wounds came from within. Private Alex F. Miranda, a U.S. Army infantryman stationed in Japan, was convicted in 1952 of the rape and murder of a young Japanese woman. His trial was fast. The witnesses were few. Forensic evidence barely explored. The racial climate, however, was heavy. Post-war resentment, distrust of local populations, and internal Army tensions created a storm, and Miranda was swept into it. He was sentenced to death by hanging, but the military sat on the sentence. Delays stretched on for years. Appeals were filed. Clemency was requested, then rejected. Finally, in 1957, the Army reversed the sentence not by mercy, but by procedural reevaluation. He wasn't released. He was resentenced to life. Miranda spent decades behind bars. His name faded, his story dissolved in files no one opened. A man once slated for death, living as a ghost inside military confinement. There was no final meal, no last words, just the long, slow march of forgotten punishment. John Arthur Bennett. We circle back to the final time a noose would ever be officially sanctioned by the United States military. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. April 13, 1961. The halls echoed with footsteps. The lights flickered under stormy skies. John Arthur Bennett, only 25, walked to his death with no crowd, no press, no goodbyes, just guards and the cold whisper of judgment. His final meal had been simple: shrimp cocktail, bread rolls, canned fruit, cake, milk, and coffee. Familiar, ordinary, almost defiant in its lack of ceremony. His last words, barely audible, "Pray for me." The trapdoor fell, the rope pulled tight, and for 17 minutes his body hung in silence. When the doctor finally pronounced him dead, the room was still. No applause, no retribution, just a record marked complete. He was buried in an unmarked grave. And just like that, military executions, once routine, now rare, entered a long sleep. Plot E and the dishonored dead. Outside of Paris lies a cemetery that most Americans will never visit. It's called the Wais-Ain American Cemetery, but within it sits Plot E, a hidden, fenced-off section of shame. Here lie the bodies of 96 American servicemen who were executed by the military during and after World War II. No names are displayed, no flags fly, only flat markers, numbered in white, no public tours, no family visits. Among them are men like Lewis Till, David Cobb, Clarence Whitfield, soldiers condemned not just in life, but in death. A burial ground built to erase. Even in death, they were treated as invisible. After 1961, the military justice system began to evolve. The courts became more transparent. The appeals process deepened, and public perception shifted. Executing one's own became less a show of strength, and more a haunting echo of unfinished wars. Though hundreds were sentenced to death over the decades, none were executed after John Arthur Bennett. Death row still exists in military prisons, but no soldier has been led to the gallows or strapped to a gurney since. In 1983, Army Private Ronald A. Gray was sentenced to death for a brutal string of rapes and murders near Fort Bragg. His crimes shocked the country. President George W. Bush approved his execution in 2008. But to this day, Gray remains alive on military death row. As of 2025, no military executions have taken place for over 6 decades. The machinery still exists, but the silence says more. They once wore the uniform with pride. They marched, they served, they swore oaths. But some crossed lines that duty could never defend. Their crimes were horrific. Their trials sometimes flawed. Their endings silent. No flags draped their coffins, no heroes' welcomes. Only shadows of justice, regret, and the questions we still can't answer. In the end, what makes these stories unforgettable isn't just the crimes. It's the chilling moment the uniform came off, for good. If you found these cases haunting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more dark history uncovered. And if you want to see a full breakdown of every civilian execution in U.S. history since 1976, check out the video now playing on screen.